Good afternoon for everybody, ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Siegrist, dear colleagues, friends, and family members. Very warm welcome in the name of the organizers. My name is Markus Keller. I'm the head, or the so-called principal investigator of the research group for professionalization history at the Department for Comparative Historical Sociology at Eötvös Loránd University. I'm excited, proud and happy at the same time. Excited because that's the first international workshop of ours. Proud because we will and can present you today our first thematic issue, Professions and Autonomy, in the journal Replica. And happy because we had the opportunity to invite Professor Hannes Siegrist. And I'm happy too because I see a lot of familiar faces. That means we are among friends. When we started in 2020, our research, we had a lot of different ideas how to do the research, how we should organize a research group. But in 2 points we agreed. We want to deal with the phenomenon of professionalization, and we want to do it in a temporally and spatially comparative perspective. In a comparative perspective, because we believe to understand the Hungarian processes of professionalization in a deeper way, we need a broader, let us say, European context. So our goal is to reveal the processes that had a role in the history of professions in Hungary from the early 19th century to the second third of the 20th. With these ideas, thoughts, we have begun our scientific journey. But since the Odyssey, as we know, every traveler needs a helper, a guide. That's why we invited Professor Hannes Siegrist to help us to build up this famous and for us so important European context. I'm sure the majority of you know him pretty well, but allow me to briefly introduce him. Professor Hannes Siegrist studied history, sociology, German literature, and that's something new for me, journalism at the University of Zurich, receiving his doctorate in 1976. In 1992, he completed his postdoctoral studies in modern history. I think in German and in Hungarian we would say habilitatio, with particular reference to economic and social history in the Department for History, Freie Universität Berlin. In another important, in 1997, he took up the chair for comparative European cultural and social history at the Institute of Cultural Science, University of Leipzig. Before that, he had several teaching and research positions in Berlin, Uppsala, Zurich, Florence, and last but not least at the Central European University in Budapest. Professor Siegrist advises on various scientific and cultural bodies and edits academic journal series and internet portals on recent European history. Since 2007, he has been a member of the Saxonian Academy of Sciences in Leipzig. He published several books, articles on the topic of professionalization, the latest one together with Dietmar Müller, Profession, Eigentum und Staat, Europäische Entwicklungen im Vergleich. But his latest work deals with a slightly different subject. It was published, as far as I know, 2019, with the title Expanding Intellectual Property, Copyrights and Patents in the 20th Century, Europe and Beyond. Another interesting topic perhaps for another workshop. Professor Siegrist, dear Hannes, we are so glad to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Markus, for the invitation. It was a good chance to see each other after a long time. When you, for example, presented your book about the professionals of education, higher or middle education in Berlin some years ago in the Hungarian Center for Culture. For me, it is a way back to an old theme of research, namely professions. And what interests me in the history and sociology of the professions are, on the one hand, the empirical evidence how it happens in several environments. This means comparison, and in order to be able to do comparisons, one needs to have some principles or typologies as points of reference. In a general way, professional autonomy and professionalization are a strategy for institutionalization of social relations and for institutionalization of relations to knowledge or to symbolic orders and so on. This is very general. The profession is a specific way of institutionalization and organization of knowledge, of work, of status, and of position, and of power, of course. So what is interesting for us then in this respect is that we look at these processes in environments, in contexts. This is why we do what in English is called historicize also these developments, and we try to find out whether there are specific paths of development in specific regions where professions work and exist since 200 and 250 or 250 years in modern times, and where professions have existed maybe from the Middle Age onwards, from the 12th century, when universities were refounded and the professions of lawyers and doctors and so on were institutionalized the first time. And I look back in the article which you have gently translated into Hungarian, which is a great honor for me. I look back to these old professions at the beginning, these old guild-like professions, and I study them, how they survive in the transformations around 1800, the shift from the old regime to the new modern forms of governance and institutions and societies. And I start with a very general topic then. In the 18th century, it is the concept of autonomy. Autonomy, of course, is also a very old concept in the society of estates and guilds and so on. There was a sense for autonomy, but it was an ascribed autonomy, not one which had to be bargained or be fixed every time anew. So the concept of autonomy was old, but then it was generalized in the transformation, in the big institutional reforms and revolutions around 1800. It was generalized because the basic agent of the liberal or constitutional or modern society was an autonomous individual, a male citizen. And he should be able to behave autonomously. That's why only those who had a certain wealth or were allowed to become voters or citizens, active citizens, and it was expected that one was able to judge about individual and collective affairs in order to participate in the public sphere and in the constitutional order. This meant that an old-fashioned type of autonomy, which the professions claimed for themselves as collective autonomy from since many centuries, where they were active as guilds of doctors, of lawyers, of apothecaries, and so on in the cities, or where they had been qualified at universities, which was also an autonomous corporation in a certain sense of the scholars. Though their autonomy was relativized by a process of generalization of autonomy. And in this transformation, they tried to reinvent a concept of professional autonomy. In some countries, it was easy. For example, in England, where the transformation had happened in the 17th century, the big transformation, and the professions had survived in some ways as autonomous, old-fashioned, guild-like professions, that was easy. But it was difficult in territories and states where the state, maybe even a liberal state and a liberal government of lay people, tried to control science, health, knowledge, and so on. And there they normally institutionalized the professionals in a new bureaucratic type of profession. That meant that, yes, the professional should have some higher qualification, should be certified, examined. Then in the real work, he had some professional individual autonomy, because the principles of science or law or so were represented and enacted by the professional, but at the same time he was integrated into a professional body which was not directed only by professionals. So that was the common continental European type of professionalization in modern times after 1800. This, in other places, people tried to emulate the English model. And this was then a competition between different types of professions and professional models during the whole 19th century. For example, German lawyers always said, we would like to be like the English lawyers. We would prefer not to be controlled too narrowly by the state and the top of the state and of bureaucracies. And of course, there were other countries. Now it is context, environments. It is about context and environments. There were liberal democratic societies where lay movements pretended that expert knowledge did not legitimize any superiority of access to functions and power and so on. This is what in Europe happened, for example, in radical democratic Swiss cantons in the early 1830s onwards. But what became very a general pattern in the United States in the Jacksonian era, where all these old-fashioned types of professional guilds and self-administered professions were abolished. And then they tried to reinvent themselves. And so we have, for 200 years, we have this problem of the highly qualified people, how to regulate their environment and their self-organization in a society which in principle does not accept privileges and ascribed qualities, but where one has to deal every day about a contract with a society. This is the problem that the old-fashioned, old regime society had an ascribed status for the professions. The new modern society has the contract as the basis of this relationship between profession, knowledge, state, market, and so on. Yes, this is the big historical background, and I showed then in the article how the professions behaved in different parts of the world, and I showed typologies like professionalization from below or from within the profession, professionalization from above, where the state has and the type of the professionalization from outside, which is not a very good term, but it means that in many countries of the world, in most countries of the world, the patterns of profession and professionalization were introduced not by the initiative of the indigenous people, but from foreign powers. Look at all these British English lawyers in the world. Among them, for example, Gandhi, who has been qualified in England and was then went then back to India, and realized that he was a full professional but not a full citizen. And this is another question, that processes of professionalization depend on the quality, how they intermingle with other processes. The processes of professionalization must be supported by other processes like state building. The state encourages professional qualification because he needs professional knowledge. The process of professionalization can be supported by nation building, nationalization. The teachers become not only teachers for specific matters, but they become also agents of the new nation state, and they guarantee that the nation states arrives in the last angle of a territory. And this is one of, and of course, Michael Keller has shown how the process of professionalization is in competition with processes of older forms of confessionalization of learning and so on. So it depends very much on this context, and this can then be shown when the older context do not no more support the professionalization, when the nationalist and national motive is no more so strong. The professions have to rely on their own knowledge. And we have seen this, for example, in the last 30 years, with the Europeanization of higher learning and the Europeanization, the opening of the labor markets and of the university and of the qualificatory systems and of the examinations. That means that the professions were the last group who was relatively liberalized in the European-wide context. Workers were mobile 50 years before, but lawyers and doctors were enclosed in their national territory. And this was for some people a little bit of a pain in recent decades. And for other people, for example, for young Italian academics, it was a very good thing because they could go to Germany or to England and work in their profession and not stay at home in Italy as non-occupied persons. So this is this mixture of professionalization with other processes. I do not go deeper into this question. I just mentioned that what I wrote in the article, that in order to invent their types of and processes of professionalization, the professions developed a new language of professionalism. They developed concepts like a learned profession. I cannot translate it exactly because in German it is more clear. Or they developed the discourse of meritocracy, of skills, of scientific knowledge, or the concept which by Andrew Abbott is translated as jurisdiction, that they have a certain sphere where they are competent and where they pretend to be autonomous. This was a language which was developed from older sources and adapted around 1800. So not only this and what means that later this language of professionalism and professionalization has been stopped in development. Nowadays we discuss about professions sometimes in the same language as people discussed around 1800. But there have always been special professions, namely the so-called new academic or learned professions, like the engineers. The engineers were patterned in the beginning after the model of the classic old-fashioned professions. In around 1800, the continental states developed technical universities and similar organizations for the qualification of technically qualified people, which they needed for the army, for the construction and building sector, and later for chemical industry and electrical industry and so on. And they, in the beginning, these were second-class professions. And they fought for a similar, an equal status with the old classic professions. And they did it by developing their own programmatic concepts and strategies, like technocracy, or the concept of Saint-Simonism, or engineers who became entrepreneurs and built up whole industries and invented industries like the chemical industry and the electrical industry, where they employed thousands of engineers and natural scientists already around 1900. And so there developed new types and positions and concepts of profession. They were more exposed to the market. They believed more to market forces and chances. But some of them were then nevertheless obliged to depend not only on the market, but also on the state, because the state became a big investor into markets in the 20th century. The warfaring state, for example, states which in the First World War, they needed to have thousands and thousands of engineers for doing their war chemical war, chemical weapons, for example, all these steel and fire weapons and so on. So the engineers became dependent not only on the market as before, but also on the state more and more. And they became in the 20th century rather more similar to the classic professions. I cannot go into that deeper because I had to finish. And then finally, state socialism invented also the state-employed engineer who was loyal to the party and state, for example. When Lenin and his comrades discussed whether the engineers and professionals and doctors and lawyers were useful or not, yes, they decided they could be useful, but they had to be controlled in their functional belongings. But they were not against engineers and higher scientific knowledge and not against lawyers and so on, because Lenin knew that a modern society could only be built with this knowledge and professions. That's why they were then called bourgeois specialists and so on, and the Mitläufer. They were needed. Only a small part of the proletarian milieus and parties were strictly against these professions, but generally they survived quite well in the 20th century, also in the state socialist systems, where of course the concept, let me say now, the Anglo-Saxon concept of liberal free profession, self-government, was not in high esteem, but the concept of profession in general, of high qualification, important functional matters, some power also, and influence in political and power questions remained strong. And these states, this was among the latest research which I guided in Leipzig for younger doctoral students. They studied, for example, what state socialism did with composers, musical composers, and so on. They were assimilated to this, and musicians, they were assimilated to the status of the older professions and of the engineers. They were no more regarded as artists in the old-fashioned individualistic sense. And this was another part of my chapter, which maybe you have been able to read. Is nowadays we are in the situation that everybody wants to become a professional, and everybody behaves as a professional. Although we are rather dissimilar with regard to our scientific knowledge, in the so-called knowledge society, everybody feels free to intervene in scientific and professional matters. And this is really a danger for the professions, but they have to find out what professionalism means nowadays also. We have this historical past behind us, we have this language, we have these terms, we have this knowledge, institutional knowledge of professions and professionalization, that we have to adapt it every time. If not, these professions become just jobs who are done by people who are hired and fired, and who have no self-consciousness, who are not proud about what they know, and who are not willing to to deal with their comrades, how do I say that? With those who do the same thing and who have the same qualification as they have. And this is now the problem of the autonomy in the so-called modern globalized knowledge society, where all these national professions try to survive, who try to find niches. When I try to discuss with Leipzig lawyers, 90% know that they work in their territory is the whole world, but 50% still think that they are local people, and they can believe in the old concept. They are not interested really in the rules, 10,000 rules which the European Union has developed in the last 50 years for the professions and how they can work and compete in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your fascinating lecture, and an extra thank you for including your insights on professions under state socialism, because that's, well, quite relevant to my research and to the lives and the experiences of many of us. And I would like to open the question and answer session after your fascinating talk. I would like to ask my friends and colleagues to please put your hands up with your questions, and also to please briefly introduce yourself, just your name, where and what you do, quick sentence about your research topic, and keep your questions as short as possible. They are really interesting and there are a lot of them, so keep them under 2 minutes if possible. I am Ilona Kappanyos, a PhD student at ELTE and the member of this Professionalization Research Group, and I study the history of maternity nurses in Hungary. So who will pose the first question? Anyone? If nobody is volunteering, I will volunteer Pap Viktor, because he had a fascinating... Oh, Markus, I will hand it over to you then.
That should be Viktor, because I think his topic is the most nearest to Professor Siegrist. So Viktor, that's your turn and your opportunity to ask and develop your research.
That's why I wanted to pass it on to him. So Viktor, if you don't mind.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Viktor Pap, and I'm too a PhD student. And my topic, my dissertation topic is the historical, social history of the Hungarian lawyers. So I would like to ask the question in connection with the Hungarian legal professions. As some introduction, in Hungary in the 19th century, the Hungarian lawyers held strong positions, and in 874 they received a new modern legal framework. This framework of the professional activities provided a broad autonomy to the lawyers. This means the bars were set up, the code of the professional ethics was created, and the disciplinary competence were exercised by, of course, the boss over the members. The appeal of the disciplinary issues, as in other countries, as in Germany, for example, was in the hands of the Supreme Court, so in the hands of the judge. The lawyers considered with the method of the disciplinary system was harmful to the interests of the profession. So after the new act, after the new legal framework, in the end of the 19th century, they initiated for a change at the legislature. So, according to the historical documents, the Hungarian lawyers look on the judge as rivals, often as enemies. So my question would be, how typical was in Central and in East Central Europe that the legal professions have fought with each other rather than with the governments? Was the struggle between the judges and the lawyers general in Central Europe?
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting question. I hope I understood the full content of the question. The problem is that not all the lawyers are equal and friends of lawyers, because they have a representative function in the system of law. And they represent competing interests in the society, what brings them, in principle, in a competitive situation. And then, at the same time, parts of them strive for new laws and new legal procedures, and others prefer the old-fashioned procedures and laws. Dietmar Müller has, for example, shown in the case of the Romanian lawyers after, maybe after the First World War, the old part of Romania, which had a relatively modern legal and property and professional, had an old-fashioned system. The lawyers from this old part of Romania were then against the rules and the systems in the new parts of Romania, which have been integrated. So you see there, lawyers are not always only on the side of the law and of the professional ethics, but they have also interests. Although, in principle, as lawyers, they must insist on a language of disinterestedness. This is a general trait of the professions, which I have not mentioned before. The normal economic citizens, the bourgeoisie, has interests. The professions pretend to be disinterested, that they behave for the general wealth. They pretend that they have an overall important function for the functioning of the whole system, the state of law, or the economic system, or the health system, and so on. So they wield their interests. Their language is a language of forewielling their interests, because they represent the interests of others. And if one has to represent interests of others, one has to have a mode of distancing herself or himself from these interests of others, and this is then built into the language. No, these legal professions are then in competing parties, because in your country also, if I remember well, lawyers were part of the politically active elites and counter-elites. And this means that lawyers do not just defend a client in a specific issue, but they want to change the order and the procedures, the general system, and this is a competitive system. They believe in competitive systems for finding out the truth. Some legal procedures, let me say, in the criminal court are made for that. It's open competition of arguments and evidence. But also in the civil law courts, there's always the search for the truth, and this is a competitive approach. And this is why I would never expect that they have a same interests. They agree in every respect. But to come back to the code of ethics and these disciplinary courts, which were delegated sooner or later to the lawyers themselves, mainly represented then by the older parts of the profession, or represented by boards who were composed of members of all the important subgroups. This is why they had these codes of ethics, which for us seem to be sometimes to be exaggerated. They have a rule for everything, and they intervene not only in professional matters in the 19th century, but also in personal matters, in social matters of the profession. But this is a specificity of the lawyers. The doctors maybe also, but look at engineers. They, of course, have also some code of conduct, written or unwritten. They pretend to have some boards or representatives, but they are much less obsessed by making detailed rules. They are more inspired by a general direction, general principles. Is that an answer to your question? I hope so. If not, you have to redo it, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. That was the answer. Thank you.
You're
All
welcome.
right. Who would like to? Victor, Tátrai Victor, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Victor Tátrai, and I am also a PhD student of ELTE. I have read your study about the professional autonomy, and I would like to ask in connection with this topic, especially the connection between autonomy and bureaucracy. My research field is the social history of the police occupation in Hungary in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So the most important question for me is how to interpret professional autonomy in a bureaucratic organization. Usually, autonomy and state bureaucracy are treated as opposites. In the second half of the 19th century, from 1873, there were one metropolitan police in Budapest as a state police under the supervision of the government, and several municipal police in rural cities in Hungary, which they called autonomous police too. There was a long debate about the nationalization and centralization of municipal police. And in this debate, the police officers supported the centralization. This is easily understandable because they wanted a higher salary, higher prestige, better chances in career mobility, which is interesting, I think. that there was an important role in their arguments that state supervision can provide professional autonomy better than municipal police. They argued that the city council and the influence and the power of local elites restrict professional autonomy more than the state supervision. So my question, in general, what is your opinion about the possibilities and the limitations of the professional autonomy in a bureaucratic organization? Is it just a professional strategy, a professional ideology in the struggle for better social status? Or can you imagine professional autonomy in a state bureaucratic system? And I am curious if you read from this aspect about the professionalization of the German police.
Thank you. This is a very, these are 2 or 3 very important questions. I try to give you an answer. First, it is a classic topic in the research of professions about the relationship between bureaucratic organization and professions. Already in the 60s, for example, the classical American sociological authors studied these issues, how a professional behaves in rather rigid organizational structures. It was about civil engineers or chemists in government administrations. It was about doctors in hospitals, which were governed by private enterprises and so on. So it is a classical question. And I recently read a very interesting issue of a French sociological journal. I do not remember the title. The first author was Dubar, D-U-B-A-R. And there were about 5 authors, French and British, and they had an issue about bureaucratic professions, mentioning also people from hospitals, but also from government bodies and from prisons and police and so on. And they call them bureaucratic professions, which is interesting that the French see that point. The Americans, Anglo-Saxon research for a long while has not accepted this combination, was not interested. My generation developed it for the continental research because it was evident that professionalization within or in the combination with bureaucratization was the general pattern, and all the other things were exceptions or niches. I exaggerate maybe now in this side, but they problematized then this relationship now in the age, this historically developed relationship, a balance between professional expertise and bureaucratic structures and demands and procedures. They find out on every level of development a certain balance between these contrasting interests and tendencies. And they come to the point then, they do then research about what happens in the last 30 years in the age of new public management. That's the last point in the history. New public management, what was developed first in Great Britain and then in some other countries and then generalized by OECD as a general program for the development of professions and bureaucracies in Europe and European Union. They they said that nowadays with public management, the trend is to make professional work business-like. What means that they emulate the institutional rules or the organizational model of private business, which divides planning and making devices from execution, from control and sanctioning. These three functions: planning of work, execution of work, and control and remuneration and sanction of work. These three functions are divided. This is what is such an intriguing thing nowadays also for scholars at universities. They must make, in German universities as a professor, you make a contract which goes into details before you start your job. And they prescribe you first what you have to do or what is expected from you that you do. And then you think that you can judge about yourself after 3 years. That is old-fashioned. Others judge about you. They have developed criteria and you are now measured by others. And whatever you have promised doesn't matter. You are measured by criteria, and others judge about your behavior and your performance. This is now a revolution in the old balance of bureaucratic and professional systems. I have now answered your question from the end. But what is interesting for you are two things. The concept of autonomy. I have shown this in this short article only briefly, was abolished in principle with the liberal revolutions. Because in France, there were only autonomous citizens on the one side and the sovereign government on the other side. In between was nothing. And intermediate bodies, so-called intermediate bodies, were not accepted, not allowed. The French doctor did not have official organizations until the late 19th century. There was some Loi Chapelier or so, where when the trade unions in general were reintroduced, also the syndicates and the associations of the professions were accepted again. That was the liberal theory of state and society. In Germany, I have described it briefly, there were always some types of intermediate bodies, not yet abolished, old-fashioned type, or in the trend of development of new factual corporate bodies, which served as intermediate bodies. What means then that the theory of state accepted that during the 19th century. At the end, you have accepted these intermediate bodies, these systems of chambers, and you have, I cite there what Max Weber has said about these intermediate bodies. It doesn't matter for him whether these are chambers of lawyers or enterprises. These are the organizations which have control of access, of entrance, which control the inner life of the organization, and which make rules for themselves, which have then to be accepted also by the environment. That was a big shift. And your case of local police versus central police shows exactly this tension then between concepts of autonomy. I suppose the central police has a concept, a very modern, bureaucratized, professionalized concept of autonomy, meaning that they would like to be empowered to do their job as good as they can. While the local police depends on local environments, on local elites. I do not know very well the German history of police. I remember that Ralph Jessen has written a doctoral dissertation. He's a friend and works as a professor in Cologne, Ralph Jessen. And there are new research works recently done about police. But, you know, these local polices in Germany, let me say in the Ruhr Valley, in the 19th century, where there were factories or mines with 5,000 workers, there were maybe 2 policemen in these new factory villages, and they depended on the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur controlled the whole thing, and the state did not intervene strongly, because the state would have had to engage thousands of policemen. And I know it from Switzerland, where these local policemen were always very narrowly bound to the local milieus and elites. And the only way to control this was to change every 3 years these policemen, to move them in order to make them independent. And this led really to a certain professionalization, because the professional who has changed 5 times his place knows then what is the thing what he really can. There are about 5 functions and five competencies and elements, and independently of context, he knows this is his core capacity. And this is the beginning of professionalization. And of course, you are right. Even today, I suppose, the professionalization in the sense of scientification of police work is initiated by the centers, not by the peripheries. And I think you have a very, very good, very interesting issue, and I'm sure people all around Europe and the world are interested in your results.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one last quick question. Anyone? One last quick question? János, then in that case, please go on.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm János Ugrai, an associate professor at University Károly Eszterházy in Eger. My research topic is the professionalization of Protestant clergy, pastors, professors, teachers. And I have a sociological question of science. I would like to ask how much professionalization research results in Germany or other European countries affect the interdisciplinary space. It is strongly typical in Hungary that, for example, the knowledge about the professionalization of teachers, pastors, or writers is only slowly and scattered integrated into the canon of educational history, church history, or literary history. The disciplines are isolated from each other. How typical is this in the European countries? Can you cite a good counter example?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have to think a moment about your interesting question. I have no problems to remember 5 titles about German Lutheran and evangelical pastors Louise Schorn-Schütte, Oliver Jans, and then there are several others. I will not continue. And I remember that Louise Schorn-Schütte has about my age, a little bit younger. Oliver Jans was a doctoral student with me, and I encouraged him also to do this research about post-Thurn. But the problem was in the beginning that these clergy professions, I remember then an author for Catholic clergy, Ollenhusen. She's called von Ollenhusen. She has done a research about clergy in Freiburg, in South Germany. Very interesting, absolutely competent. And she said later to me that it was exceptional that she had access to the archives. This was the problem. That the Catholic Church, you see it nowadays, are not very avid to open archives. They prefer to control them themselves. Because, and Ingrid von Ollenhusen always told me, the Catholic clergy is not a profession. It is an order. It is another type of community. Because the question is not about the best knowledge, but it is about it's rather a scholastic issue with Catholic clergy and discipline and bureaucracy and so on. The evangelic clergy becomes a scientifically based profession in the 19th century. The basis became history, hermeneutics, systematic reading and interpretation of Bible and so on. And there were rivaling schools. And it was not only about belief, but it was also about the scientific basis of belief and the texts into which one believes. The problem is maybe that the interest in these professions is a little bit lower, because we have in Germany, for example, we still have the general history department, and we have the church history chairs. And some of these church history chairs are not specifically interested in historical issues. And they do not even like such general approaches like professionalization. It's not their business. It's not their issue. Of course, they are interested how to know how the work of the pastor has changed in reaction to the needs of the believers, like the change in the role of the pastor when nobody wanted anymore to meet the church service on Saturday or Sunday, because the workers had to work at that time, and so nobody was there, and so the pastors went to the workers, this form of pastoral work, and so these were new concepts. But I think it's very, very important to do studies about these professions, because if not, we exclude these types of professions who are not just scholars and scientists, but who are practitioners and who are a bridge, who intermediate. And this is one important point in the history of professionalization. The intermediation between humanities and science and the everyday practice of people. what are they good for? How can they be applied? And this is one thing which I would lament openly about developments in the history of professionalization in the last 25 years. In my country, Switzerland, Germany, France, a trend was away from studying the professions to studying the history of sciences and disciplines, the narrow world of the discipline, how to make scientific orders, the construction of sense, of methods, and so on. And in the last 25 years, in Germany, the professors, university professors for the history of the 20th century, the highest chance to get the chair was for people who did before history of science, and especially their science. Historians who write about historiography became preferably professors for history, and so on. And that means in your argument, we are generally in a trend which you observe in your field. And I can only comment that after a while we have to change the topic. We have to dissolve institutes. If this trend towards history of science was an international trend coming from California, then encouraged by the jubileums of German universities. The oldest universities became 700 or 600 or 500 years old in the last 20 years. So everybody started to write historiography of the universities, and then it went further to the historiography of disciplines and so on. And there was excellent work done in this context. It's clearly because the history of science is a factor of distancing oneself from the protruded language of science, for criticizing categories, consensus which are obsolete, and so on. So it has a very, very important critical function. But I have stopped recently a former student of mine, a very dear former collaborator. She had no more trust. She did no more trust into the history which she tells as a historian. She only wrote the critic of the historiography of the others. She's a representative of global history. I agree with her in many respects, but I told her it's better to respect the work done by others and build and integrate it together, and not only criticize the methods and so on, because then you are a specialist for methods and you become critical also, and you have no more the chance to form images of the past. The better narrative is the thing which wins at the end, not always the better method. You can build together 10 methods and have at the end the best story. Everybody wants to know this story. But if you haven't a good story, which can be commented, criticized, or narrated, you are in the losing situation. Sorry, it's only a consolation and a self-critic. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much for answering our questions, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming up with them. And now I would like to hand the microphone over to Kirjuji, where she will introduce the publication she and to a lesser extent all of us have been working on.
All right, thank you very much, and good afternoon. It was really a nice opportunity to hear you, Professor Siegrist, because, well, one of the central papers in this publication is your your text that we've chosen from the book that you've edited with Dietmar Müller, and we are really happy and thank you very much for your generosity to give us the copyright of the Hungarian translation. Well, it's a funny situation because all of us know this thematic issue except for you, and I wrote a long text hoping for a larger audience, but now I will cut it a bit shorter because I think that we've heard so many interesting information so far that I do not want to get everybody exhausted by the end. So, well, I just well, as Markus has already mentioned, this group has set off some 1 year ago, or approximately a year ago. We started working together, and as you see, there are our so-called junior members or junior researchers, and there are these senior researchers, and it is really a very good opportunity for all of us to work together, students and professors and assistant professors. And so it is our very first collective product, actually, this thematic issue that is forthcoming in a Hungarian social scientific journal named Replika. And actually, I can relate to the last question from János, because we are really in an interdisciplinary field between sociologists and historians, and well, it is some kind of aim for us to connect these fields. The department where Markus and myself are working, it's in the Faculty of Social Sciences, but actually we are dealing with historical, sociological issues, and we hope that this block, this thematic issue, will have an audience both at the Department of History and or the Faculty of History and the sociologists. And we have collected and designed this issue in order to reach a broad audience, and we hope we will manage to do that. So actually, this block, this thematic issue, is designed. It consists of two big parts. There are two text translations that are basically has to do more with theoretical issues, and then another. In the second half of the block, there are case studies on Hungarian professions, on history of Hungarian professionalization, and these case studies are, well, actually bounded together by their usage of common concepts and theoretical considerations, and one very important key concept is the concept of autonomy, because when we started to work together, we very soon realized that there are many big holes or unmapped territories in the history of professionalization in Hungary, and one big black hole was the systematic adaptation of the concept of autonomy, and so we decided to somehow fill this hole. Well, what is common in the case studies is that all of them use or all of them try to relate to some common perspectives which all of these case studies use. First, one of these perspectives is the relationship of professionals and society, be this society regarded as clients, users, consumers, or whatever. Then the second perspective is a relationship between the professions and the state. And the third very important dimension or perspective that all these case studies are using is the relationship of professions with fellow professions or fellow occupations. And so all these case studies, all the three case studies that are in this block, try to reflect or try to be very clear on these perspectives and try to describe the profession, the autonomy of professions with regards to these three perspectives that I've mentioned. And well, I will just show. Well, I'm not sure it makes sense to share my screen because because all the titles are in Hungarian. But just to show you how this block is built, I try to. Well, I hope everybody's seeing it now. So. And I will talk about these texts very briefly. So you can see your name here. So it starts with an introduction that's written by Markus and myself, and it is actually a historiography of the concept of autonomy. Well, I do not want to go into the details now because we have talked about that actually very intensely today. And then the first block consists of two texts. One is yours. Well, I definitely do not want to go into the details of that now because I think all of us have read it, and thank you really very much again for the copyrights and for your lecture, because I think it put some things into a new perspective, at least for me today. Well, I would like also mention the name of the translator, who is unfortunately not here today, but he has done a really very good work. He's Roland Perényi, who has translated your text. And as you see, your company is Randall Collins in this blog. Who has a very different perspective, but well, actually this is something like candy for our sociologist colleagues. I think this is really a delicacy for them, for those and also for those historians who are or who would like to become familiar with the sociological perspective on the long-term process of professional rivalries. It has a very specific concept on professionalization, or let us better call it on the monopolization of markets, and something that we did not or we've mentioned today, but did not go into the details of how markets and professions are in interrelation with each other. But it is a central question for Collins in his text. And well, the English title of this article is "Market Closure and the Conflict Theory of the Professions," which is, well, sorry, I come back because I do not see when it's disturbing me. So it's market closure and the conflict theory of the professions. I'm sure you know the text pretty well, and it was a very important point for us, or a starting point for us, to try to understand professions from this conflict theory point of view. And it was also very interesting because the term itself, market closure, is really not easy to translate into Hungarian. Well, and that made, I cannot see Viktor Tátrai here on my screen, but he is the one who is dealing with the police. And he was brave enough, he was the only one from among us who was brave enough and determined enough to sum up the history of this expression, market closure. He went through the sociological theory and also the Hungarian reception. So he started from of course, the original German concept of Max Weber, Schließung, and it came up to market closure or closure, and he developed a concept how we can use it in Hungarian. We have some. There are texts that have already used this concept, but we propose now a new translation because we think it describes better the whole process of closure. We regard it as a process, and so we were searching for a good word, and finally, well, it wouldn't say you anything, but we've chosen lezárás as a good Hungarian translation. The translator of this text was Ilona, who you already know, and she has done really a very, very good work on that. So I think it's not an easy text in English, and it's not an easy text in Hungarian, but I think everybody will love it once printed. And then comes the second half of the block where the Hungarian case studies are edited. The first one who I would like to mention is Viktor Pap, who is dealing with lawyers, and he writes on legal professions, precisely on the culture of complaint, which is a method in the hands of lawyers in order to enhance their autonomy, or it's a discursive method which they use in order to gain larger or bigger autonomy, and he gives a very, very detailed case study by analyzing or examining the professional press of the lawyers. The second text is the text of Gergely Magos, who is unfortunately not here today, but he has dealt with the historiography of professionalization quite deeply. But his present paper in this issue is on the Sovietization of pharmacy in Hungary after the Second World War. Regarding autonomy, his story shows that he shows us how the traditional labor of pharmacists, meaning the manual magistral preparation of medicine, was reorganized in order to fit the requirements of a planned economy, Soviet type planned economy. That is how pharmacists' work was made measurable, actually, and how it was fit to centralized norms, and it really interrelates with the concept of autonomy, or the issue of autonomy, because his story, or the story of the pharmacist, shows us that that the suppression of manual medicine production and the support for some kind of Taylorian labor organization may also be interpreted as the curtailing of individual autonomous work, and he shows us this story of reformation of pharmacists' labor or work. And last but not least, there is a text from Markus, who well, I do not. I think I do not have to introduce his work on secondary school teachers, but now he deals with the autonomy of Hungarian secondary school teachers in the second half of the 19th century. And well, he argues that despite the growing control and regulation by the state and the influence of the churches in the period, secondary school teachers and teaching staff did have and was able to maintain considerable professional autonomy, and he shows us this fact in his paper. So actually, that is the block. I think it's really a nice and compact. I think it was a pleasure to work with you, dear group, and I hope that our readers will be not only educated by this blog, but they will enjoy reading it. We've tried everything to have a good result, and I hope that in very short time, in 1 or 2 weeks' time, the issue will be in print, and so we can send you an example, Professor Siegrist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zsuzsi. 2 hours ago, I said I'm excited, proud, and happy in the same time. Now what I'm feeling is gratefulness, gratitude. Thank you, Ilona, and especially thank you, Professor Siegrist, that you came with us, that you came to us, and it was, I think, a really sparkling afternoon. And I think for these moments we are working for, and then when we are thinking about why it's interesting to be a scientist, why it's interesting to be a historian, and why it's too good to be a social scientist, then these moments came to our mind. So thank you again. Thank you, dear colleagues. Have a nice summer. Professor Siegrist, if you have time, visit our Facebook and our homepage. There are a lot of information about us and about our activity. So, and I hope we will see each other offline and not only online in the not so far future. Good. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be with you, Sparkling, and I'm very interested in your blog. Hopefully you can disseminate it also then in another language. I'm not against Hungarian, and I admire all the Hungarians who are able to speak it, but we are not. And hopefully you get also money for developing this blog further, because one needs to have such instruments of communication nowadays. And what you have told about the single research articles in this blog, it sounds very interesting. I would like to read it. I'm sure many others would like to read it, and the world becomes bigger and bigger. And we have the same problems. We are dealing with the same problems, isn't it? Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Say goodbye.
Goodbye.